Hello, and this is some feedback on a summative piece of work that a student has kindly offered to submit. It's a 1500 word assignment and the title is Social Model of Disability. I haven't read it, so I'm going to go through that process now and take you with me. So it's 1500 words, which means that this needs to be an assignment where you hit the ground running, and your introduction and conclusion need to be really quite concise. And I suppose you might be looking at 100, 150 words for that. So let's just see here. So this is 80 words. So you need to keep them tight, but they need to be informative and do the job they need to do. So if you've watched the video on introductions, it's being clear about saying what you're going to talk about, why you're going to talk about it, what is the debate that you're going to have in your assignment, what is your argument, what's the key point that you're going to demonstrate in your essay. So this student starts off by saying, in this assignment, my aim is to discuss the impact of the social model of disability on the lives of individuals with learning disabilities since the 1970s. I will do this by incorporating some key legislations and policies that have affected the lives of individuals with learning disabilities in that time. I also aim to demonstrate how policy and legislation have evolved over the course of 40 years to allow for increased empowerment and advocacy of individuals with learning disabilities. Okay, so there's a little bit of repetition in there. We've said 80 words, and an assignment of this length, I would say every word counts. So the first sentence, which is identifying that this is about individuals with learning disabilities since the 1970s. So that's kind of, what is this about? So this about legislation of 40 years becomes a repetitive piece of information in a tight paragraph. So this is what it's about. So why is this important? So maybe it's not just about individuals with learning disabilities, but it's about individuals with learning disabilities and their increased empowerment and advocacy of those individuals. So my assignment is about a review, perhaps, of whether or not individuals with learning disabilities, whether their self-advocacy or advocacy for their needs has increased over the last 40 years. So that would be, why is that important? Lack of advocacy means lack of voice, lack of being heard, lack of services being appropriate, etc., etc. So that would be, what's it about? Why is this important? And then what is the model? And what we see here in the next paragraph starting is the situation of individualistic medical model as opposed to the social model of disability. So again, that could be in the introduction, but that's the debate you're going to have. How we conceive what is advocacy and what is the concept of a learning disability. And how much is that about individual need, and how much of that is about how we are socially constructed, which may limit the value and inclusion of people who learn differently to others. And then the line of argument in that. So let's just scan down this first one to see where the line of argument is. So as yet, I'm not sure I've seen what this student's view is of that, but I guess this would form part of the introduction for the reasons that I've said. So that would then be a new paragraph. So here, I've just taken this, so it says this approach has stemmed from the perspective of a person with a disability. So at that point, I'm not sure which approach it is, whether that's the social model or the medical model. and we introduced here social model placed emphasis on societal values and cultures. Yeah. So the thing I think that we're perhaps just missing at the start is identifying where that is with a learning disability. So rather than generic terms of disabled people, because we're looking particularly at learning disabilities, perhaps offering the definitions of that, how that's constructed within these two different models, setting the basis, the context, situating your argument is probably the thing to do at the start. Which makes me think that in these very short essays, you probably have 6 paragraphs. You have your introduction and your conclusion. Say they take 150 words each on average. Then you would have, it can be less. This isn't like definite figures. And then you'll have roughly about 6 paragraphs to build your argument. And so you need to begin by contextualising your argument, perhaps, and then allowing that to be unpacked with the different themes that you pull out of it through the paragraphs. So what's good here is that the student has talked about valuing people and the Human Rights Act and other papers from the 1970s, because they're situating this 40 years ago about what was then and what is now. So it's important to include disability acts and things that would impact on our construction of people with learning disabilities. However, what I see is in this paragraph immediately is limited. One, it's limited to 100 words, so you're limited in what you can pack into a paragraph and what is the purpose of that paragraph. Remember that I've talked about paragraphs being, in a previous video, being stepping stones kind of things across a river. So how we get from one side to the other. And each stepping stone has to have its own substance for you to be able to step on it and take your weight. So there's an internal structure to your paragraphs too. What contribution is this paragraph making to get me from this essay 40 years ago to now? So, and it's situating what part of the whole landscape is this paragraph giving us. And because it is dominated by legislation, what they're not getting is the intersect between legislation and something else. So if we've got the social and medical models, then there's capacity there to have a discussion about whether the legislation facilitated or limited, one or other of those models, perhaps. And your line of argument at the beginning would navigate you through those things. So why am I saying this now? Why would I say something differently then? So then the student moves on to empowerment. Empowerment of individuals with learning disabilities to be afforded the same opportunity in life. And that's kind of a blanket statement, a statement of intent of what they think is appropriate. And it's about equitable access to services, to the potential to do what you want to do in your life like anybody else. An individual's needs should be thoroughly assessed in order to enable professionals to determine the best plan of action. So this is interesting. So even within this is there's a judgment statement there about needs being thoroughly assessed. And again, it's this thing about, does that lean more to the medical model than the social model? So we assess your needs rather than society lifts itself to accommodate that, where there doesn't need to be an assessment of need in that way. These are things that need a lot of complex thoughts, but that's interesting, just that the language we take up and use ourselves, and how we need to be critically reflective of what it means, what we're imparting when we do that. So what they're saying is that if you have been assessed, then that would lead you to greater levels of empowerment and can facilitate informed choices. And these are not necessarily incorrect, but they are maybe idealistic views. And then in a critical essay, you would argue about that and critique it. and I can just say my mind got taken away there because I just saw on the next line that the students put forward that Thompson argues that the stereotypical idea that an individual with a disability is dependent takes away the notion that any power they may have and places it back in the hands of the individuals. So, and then how we use our power in efficient ways possible. So the students got some key sentences there which are really fundamental to the issues they may want to discuss. And I suppose there's the possibility that they could take any one of those and actually build a paragraph around each one, which would then perhaps look at what facilitates those choices, what complicates it with practitioners, where's that power imbalance of how we see ourselves as the professionals to assess and determine, and the facilitators who need to encourage equitable participation of those that we work with. So can you see how that would be an interesting paragraph to negotiate as a stepping stone, and how has that changed over the past 40 years? I mean, 40 years might have been a bit too much of an expanse in a 1,500 word essay, but I hope you're getting the point that I'm making about that. So some really interesting thoughts in this paragraph, but they're not drawn out enough because they're all condensed in here. And sometimes I think when we're writing, we have these ideas and we sort of put them down and they become these little collections. And one of the skills in learning to write is about how we dovetail and knit those things together. I don't know, the idea of little coloured balls of wool have just come to mind, you know, and how you'd knit them to make a sort of multicoloured jumper. And then the student comes back on to valuing people again, and this is, well, it's a long sentence. I usually give feedback to students to say a sentence doesn't constitute a paragraph. So again, they put something in there, so it's something in mind that was interesting, but it doesn't relate to another part of the discussion of why they're using that, and you know, how does that embed itself in. And if you have longer paragraphs, that's quite a longer one, 162, you can build up some arguments in them where this is 50 words. It's a very long sentence. Okay, and then the student comes on to advocacy and situates that from the 1970s. So this is good. So we've kind of got advocacy as an issue and looking at it in its historical context. I'm just scanning for this paragraph. Yeah, so at this point we've got a student who's identifying key issues that need to be discussed, but perhaps doesn't quite have the confidence or the ability to extend those arguments at the moment. I've got to say this is like one of the first essays from an undergrad student. And yeah, so what they're identifying is that the idea of advocacy falls in line with the social model, which is right. And perhaps when you're doing that, so when you're thinking of what your key points will be in an essay this size, it's thinking, well, what is my argument about advocacy? How is that supported by legislation? So, you know, not only linked to policy, the value in people, but what legislation does that link to? And what are the conflicts and the barriers? Because sometimes legislation may say something, but actually achieving that can be very difficult because resources aren't there, or the law can be interpreted in different ways. And we can't just assume social models are good and other models are not good, because it's how they're integrated and we understand our holistic selves. And again, we've got the Care Act here. So again, they're drawing on legislation in their mind, but they've not linked it to anything in the essay at this time. So these, can you see how these then become sort of fragmented? They're not equal size stepping stones to get us across the river. They're kind of, there's a lack of consistency just in this structure, and how we're going from advocacy to the Care Act, and now we're coming on to, again, other aspects of of what this means about being in control. And this idea of budgets and finances could be something that would form part of the original thought in the, you know, with learning disabilities, social medical models about empowerment and control. So having control of their money, how the state regulate that, and what you're allowed to have. The complexities of trying to apply for funds where you perhaps need somebody who doesn't have a learning disability to enable you to access what you need to access, and where does that come with power and enablement from the state down, because then, you know, where is privacy and the right for a private life if people know what your money is, or things like that. So you can have different arguments and critique those things. So we go on again with them identifying, can you see again, just these kind of short sentences. It's really worthwhile not only looking at the content of what you talk about, but just the physical structure can give you a clear indication of where you're at in the development of these concise and comprehensive arguments and discussions. Okay, so this is interesting. So adapting yourself to work within the social model of disability, because there's an acknowledgement there that we're all kind of conditioned to a certain way of viewing the world, and perhaps we have to have a shift if we're going to view the world differently, which makes me think about our early education, and changing the social perhaps isn't just changing it around the individuals that we're focusing on for our work in this essay or as practitioners, but actually how do we broaden that out and have a more macro view about what needs to change for society. So I'll just scroll down to look at this. So this is, can you see now we've got quite a substantial paragraph there, 199 words. That's probably the size of a paragraph that I would be looking for. And what you can see, I'll just leave you to read that, I won't read it out, is that there's a clear argument developing, and I would say there's kind of a confidence. The student knows exactly what they want to say in this case, and they feel quite confident about situating themselves within this social model. So it's something that comes in a really concise and clear form. And again, they could look at, you know, what legislation supports our ability to work in a way that would be viewed as good practice. And I suppose maybe the thing that's missing if we're looking for, you know, these higher marks is kind of what theories underpin this. So what is the theoretical concepts that support social models and medical models, and why is one perceived to be perhaps more positive than the other, or not, depending on how you view the world. Person-centred practice, which is really good. And again, right, so now we probably have a too long a paragraph. We'll just scroll up. So this is 286 words. So I would say there's probably 2 points being made within this paragraph rather than one. But what we can see is links to legislation and the Mental Health Act. Let me just go here. Priestley, 98, argues the notion of individuals with disabilities requiring care due to their impairments on language use doesn't allow for different views. So what we have here is an older reference, and it would be interesting, again, trying to cover 40 years, probably too much to do in an essay of this size. But language that we've used, you know, that could form the essay. You know, the language that we used has changed, and then look at some of that language and where that fits more into the medical model or the social model. So, and as you're writing and drafting out your essays, you know, these ideas may come forward about, oh, I could, you know, finely tune that, or this actually is another component, another paragraph that I would have in that, you know, use of language and how we communicate. So that's really good. And then we come down to the conclusive paragraph. Just want to check, because I've kind of got into me counting numbers now. 180. So this is a, you know, I mean, I'm saying 200 words per paragraph on average, and And I guess in an essay of this size, I'd probably try, and if I was writing it, to condense the introduction and the conclusion a bit, so I got that extra marks capacity in the main body of the essay. And as I said, if you check out the introduction to an essay video, the conclusion is the introduction flipped. So you start by saying what you've talked about, what the debate was, and then leave with your final key message. So you just reverse the formula from the introduction. And that's that. I'm going to leave it there. I hope that was helpful.